that help all Alaskans and not any one specific group. But we need to think of this from a strategic level and try and tie in all the loose ends that we deal with in this state. So, Steve, it's all yours.
Thanks very much, Terry, and Juanetta, thanks for the invitation to come and do this morning. How big is this group, or how small is it today?
Right now, we've got about 13 people online, and we're going to have probably a few more joining us. I think we'll have 16 total. Okay,
here's what I had in my mind, what I would like to do. I've got about 15 substantive slides that mostly address how this port fits into the Alaska supply chain and what it is, our mission is, and the like. And we'll talk a little bit about the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic and how it's affected the port. But if I begin to start talking about things that you guys already know about and you would rather we just get to the Q&A, I'm happy to go there as well. I enjoy doing these things, and sometimes I wonder if I'm preaching to the choir and telling everybody stuff they already know when they have burning questions they would rather ask first. So if we find ourselves in that situation, I won't be offended if you tell me to knock off the talk and let's get to the Q&A. But absent that, I'll get started doing this the way I had it planned. And as I understand it, Juanetta is going to be my slide flipper, because the version of PowerPoint I've got on my iPad doesn't give me that kind of power. Do you have the slides up, Juanetta? Because all I see is me.
I see the slide.
You're up there, Steve. We got it.
Okay, so we're on the main slide coming in, and just let me walk you through a little bit of background on the port. So, you know, the Port of Alaska, we are municipally owned. We are a city department, and we serve Anchorage, the state of Alaska, and the nation. We opened for business in 1961, and the intent at the time was only to support regional economic development. And the Assembly in October of 2017 changed our name to the Port of Alaska, because what they had originally envisioned this place to be drastically changed after the after the March 1964 earthquake, and we've been a asset to the entire state ever since. You can change the slide now, thanks. So if you're a logistician and you operate up here, you better think and behave as if you live on an island, because 90% of all the Alaska inbound freight is marine cargo, either brought in either by ship or barge. Air and truck carriers account for about 5% of all the statewide inbound freight, and the state's biggest industries, oil, tourism, fishing, mining, and timber, all rely on marine commerce for their survival. Next slide. The Port of Alaska is the state's primary inbound cargo handling facility, as Terry says. We handled some 3.9 million tons of fuel and cargo in 2018, and we saw that number grow to 4.3 million tons in 2019. That might sound like a big number, and in our little world over here, that's a pretty significant big number. But if you compare us to a place like the Port of Long Beach, those guys do between 3.5 and 4 million tons a week. So context is we're a fairly big fish in kind of a small pond. We handle goods consumed by 90% of the Alaskan population, and we account for more than 80% of the vans and containers shipped to South Central Alaska ports, eventually distributed to every region of the state. We account for 75% of all non-petroleum marine cargo shipped into Alaska, exclusive of Southeast Alaska, which gets barge service directly from Puget Sound. And we account for 50% of all the freight shipped into Alaska by all modes, as I mentioned earlier, and supports about $14 billion in commercial activity within the state, and is the state's main inbound containerized freight and fuel distribution center. Next slide. So half the freight that crosses the dock is delivered to destinations outside of Anchorage, statewide, all the way down to Southeast. It's a limited amount that goes down to Southeast, but after the earthquake, it was interesting. There was a small group that traveled to Juneau to meet with the legislature early on in the session, and they were talking about the concerns that they weren't going to get McDonald's hamburgers and buns because all that stuff came into Anchorage and then made its way down to the stores in Juneau. Who knew? We kind of knew we did aviation gasoline for small airplanes, but some of those other consumer items were a surprise to us. So our tentacles stretch a lot farther than even we thought. The Port of Alaska's cargo business is relatively stable, and it's linked to the state population and economic activity. We live in a state that produces for export relatively nothing. Crude oil, frozen seafood. Crude oil we don't see at all. Frozen seafood, we see that which comes off the Kenai Peninsula processing facilities, but most of it goes out of Dutch Harbor. So this is a consumer economy. It is not much of a production and ship out for sale elsewhere kind of a place. And the port operates at about a 35 to 40% capacity. When you brag about supporting 85 to 90% of the state population, you're talking about a number that is just over 500,000 people that only eat so much, go buy new clothes so often, put gas in their car tanks once a week, buy a new car every 10 or 12 years. So that's awful predictable. And there's nothing on the horizon that leads us to believe anyway, that there is this big boom looming that we need to get ready for. So year to year to year, it's a relatively predictable demand level. And we can support that with a facility the size of the one we have now. And if it wasn't in such terrible shape as a consequence of corrosion, we'd be open for business every day and not losing a whole hell of a lot of sleep over being able to continue to support the population. Next slide, please. Okay. So today, the Port of Alaska is the state's most versatile port, and it handles a wide variety of domestic and foreign cargo carriers. We have 3 general cargo terminals. There's lift-on, lift-off gantry cranes. There's a roll-on, roll-off capability that is kind of proprietary to one of the port users. And we can do break bulk and dry bulk offload and onload if necessary. We have 2 petroleum terminals. We have a facility that is operated by Alaska Basic Industries Anchorage Sand and Gravel, where they handle cement. We have a dry barge landing. And we have the capability on the off days, if you will, when the container ships aren't here, to be able to handle cruise ships. And some of the, there's some challenges there, but we've done it pretty consistently for the last 7 or 8 years. And we can go to the next slide. So cargo handling, logistics, and efficiency are driven by our proximity to the markets, the transportation infrastructure, and all the road connections. Port of Alaska is at the state's population and business hub. Anchorage docks leverage or are leveraged by hundreds of millions of dollars of freight-related private sector infrastructure, all created by private sector investment on municipally owned land. We have 125 acres of cargo handling infrastructure, including intermodal cargo transport connections, 3.4 million barrels of refined petroleum storage, 60,000 tons of cement storage, and all of the dock-related infrastructure for handling how that stuff is delivered, over a wide variety of different compositions. Next slide. The Port of Alaska's intermodal transport hub that connects state's primary cargo distribution systems. We are very close. Our neighbors are, Linden, who runs Alaska Marine Lines, and the North Star barge terminals that serve Western Alaska. They're right outside the gate. We're next to the Alaska Highway System. 60% of all Alaska residents live within 2-hour drive of the port, and 75% of all Alaskans live on the Anchorage Connected Road System. There are multiple rail connections to the port, and Alaska's Railroad's main cargo yard is at grade and within a half a mile of the facility. Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport and J-Bear runways, you can see them from the port. So we're pretty centrally located. And the port's valve yard and pipelines connect on and off port tank farms, truck loading racks, rail loading racks, right to J-Bear, right to Ted Stevens, and to the Marathon refinery down in Nikiski. And all of this connected infrastructure gives the port more inbound cargo handling capacity than every other port in South Central combined. Next slide, please. So there are three core functions that we serve here. We serve the commerce mission, we serve national defense, and we serve the state with respect to earthquake resiliency and disaster response and recovery capability. And we go to the next slide. Commerce, pretty straightforward. It's the business of bringing freight and fuel into the state for residents and to support the Alaska business economy. The commerce function generates the vast majority of the port's revenue, and it pays for all of the port's operations. And the entire state benefits from the port. So for example, 90% of the liquid fuel shipped into South Central Alaska crosses this dock, including most of the jet fuel used at J-Bear and at Ted Stevens. Virtually all of the avgas burned in the state comes into here first and then gets distributed throughout the state. 80% of all the cement used in Alaska is shipped through this port. And methanol, which is a new product that was added a few years back in a facility that was created by Delta Western, is the anti-icing agent that's used downhole in pipelines up on the North Slope to maintain winter production, and also in Cook Inlet from time to time. Next slide. Our national defense mission stems from the fact that we are one of 17 commercial strategic seaports nationwide, which means we have a responsibility to support the DoD mission. And in our case, our main customer is U.S. Army Alaska. Strategic Seaport Mission is effectively an unfunded federal mandate. The port maintains DoD required minimum facilities and capabilities that exceed the Port of Alaska's relatively small market needs. And DoD expects to have certain capability available to them when they need it. But as I said, it's an administrative challenge. It's a infrequent use arrangement. And it comes with no contribution to the cost of maintaining the infrastructure, other than they pay their bills when they use the port. Next slide, please. This is an important one to the state, national disaster, and to the and to the nation. It's natural disaster response, recovery, and resilience. And the port is key to the state and federal disaster recovery plans. It's vital to timely and successful response to virtually every state and federal government disaster response and recovery plan. We are mentioned in every single one at the level where there's an expectation that relief supplies and equipment will be able to cross our dock and be brought to bear on anything that's going on up here. It costs significantly more to rebuild a resilient earthquake-ready dock than merely a commerce-ready dock, and earthquake resilience produces no significant port revenue. And I think by that, is simply stated, is if a commercial entity was building and operating this facility, they build it at the least cost possible. But as a public entity, we have a responsibility to support the resiliency mission, and therefore there's a premium, and it has to get added on to anything that we construct here, so that we can assure the folks that rely on us that, God forbid something happen that's huge, we'll be around to help support that. Next slide, please. So we lived through the earthquake, as Terry mentioned, and we are also, holding our own with respect to adverse impacts from the ongoing pandemic. I tell people that as I sit here in my office and look out the window, if I lived here on the port and had no access to news and just looked out over what was going on here every day, I would have absolutely no idea what was going on out there in the rest of the world. It has been so business as normal that that's shocking and surprising by comparison to what some other folks are going through. The cargo ships come and go. The fuel deliveries come and go. The only real impact that we've had on our bottom line is that we lost the entire season of cruise ships, which this year was going to be a biggie. There were going to be 14. Usually we see between 9 and 10. This year would have been 14, and it would have been 2 port calls by the Queen Elizabeth that Cunard Lines put on the calendar. And all of that got canceled, you know, mostly because, and I was talking to Juanetta about this earlier, there is a passenger ship variant of the Jones Act. The same rules apply. If you're a foreign flag vessel and you're leaving one U.S. port to go call on the next one, you have to stop at a foreign port in between. And that was always Canada. Or you depart from a foreign port before you go to a U.S. port. And when Canada closed the borders and closed their ports to cruise ships, the option of, you know, the capability to do that went to 0 for everything that serves this market up here in Alaska. So they had to cancel them all. That's pretty unfortunate. And for us, between what would have been revenue generated by supporting the vessel when it was at the dock, and add to that our portion of what is annually the collected head tax that the state collects, we always made the cut for being in the group that got a share of that head tax based on the number of passengers that came through here. When you add all that together, it was a little north of $250,000. And we'll lose that from our revenue stream this year. And you know, it's gonna sting, but it's not a deal breaker for us because we have such a diverse you know, commodity line that we support here, that all our eggs are not in that one basket. So we can you know, with a little bit of pencil sharpening on our own and cost cutting measures, we can survive and stay open for business. While this is, you know, while this is unfortunate, it is not a you know, it's not the be all and end all for the port. And the other thing that's been continuing on schedule is the construction going on our new petroleum cement dock that is a part of the Port of Alaska Modernization Program. And if you have never saw PAMP before, that's the acronym for the Port of Alaska Modernization Program. And the first phase of that, construction of a petroleum and cement terminal, the big piece that began, the in-water construction that began this summer, is continuing, only impacted by the fact that the contractor, Pacific Pile and Marine, had to come up here from Seattle, and they probably experienced about a month's worth of delays preparing the crew and the workforce for coming to Alaska, you know, given all the rules that we put in place for quarantine and all of the related, you know, health requirements that they're going to have in place here for the safety of the workforce. So that put them about a month behind, but they are making great time on schedule right now. Next slide. So I have a couple of slides about the modernization program, and we'll talk about it a little bit. As a reminder, it is not an expansion project. You heard me mention earlier that the existing facility is only operating at about 25 to 40% capacity. So we really don't need anything any bigger than what it is we have now. So it's a dock replacement initiative, not a grow the size of the infrastructure initiative. Next slide. And as I mentioned, construction is underway. The picture that you're looking at there is what the finished petroleum and cement terminal is going to look like. The fact that we can build that and not interrupt the ongoing business is because it's being located south of everything that is going on now. You see the cement dome there in the picture. That is Alaska Basic Industries Anchorage Sand and Gravel Cement Storage Facility. And it's right behind that. So if you can see that dome from downtown, you can probably see the big cranes, barge mounted and landside, that are handling, standing up the piles and hammering the piles in place all of this summer. When we're done at the end of the summer, we will have the trestle and platform of the new dock completed. Out to bid right now is the contract for the 2021 portion of this, which is to put all the appurtenances on the platform to make it a dock, to add the fendering, and to add use what you see out there is the mooring dolphins and the catwalks to get out to those mooring dolphins. The kind of skinnier stuff that spreads out into the water on both sides of that tanker that you're looking at there. So that's all next summer's work. We open the bids on that, I think, at mid-July, and that'll give us a sense of what the total cost of this will be. And next slide. And once we get, once we are confident that we've got our act together and understand what the plan of finance is going to be to finish the petroleum cement terminal, we're at about the 90% point now. The last piece that's missing is, the final cost piece. We've been operating, or we will be operating up through this summer with state grant money that we received several years ago that's been, sort of standing by for an actual reason to spend it, and we are now there. What we don't have the money for now, with the exception of about $45 million in federal grants that we've received through 2 grant programs, what we don't know is what the final cost of next summer's construction will be. So we subtract from that number the $45 million that we have in grant-related free money, and that remainder is what it is we're going to have to borrow and add some debt service coverage to the program here to complete. So all of that mathematics will be done before the end of the summer, but we're waiting for that one magic number to be able to get that done. And once that's behind us, then we begin in earnest the real conversations with respect to the next phase of this, which will be replacement of the cargo docks. And we have to keep in mind a couple of different things when we're talking about the cargo docks. We have to look at what is in the public's best interest to construct in size and flexibility, and what is it that we need to have in place to support those users that come here now, so that we strike a balance between their ability to continue to efficiently operate here, but not over-construct that which makes this more expensive than the public is going to have to support for that portion of what we do next that winds up being debt service related as well. So it's a bit of a challenge. The conversations have already started with everybody who will be a user of the cargo docks, and we continue to gather requirements, talk about cost savings and efficiencies that we can all gain to skinny that cost down. But we are a long way from having a design that we can put a number on and stand behind. And we don't want to make some of the mistakes that our predecessors have made about throwing a big number out there, scaring the living daylights out of everybody, and not being able to defend it or stand behind it. And that's a big lesson learned that those of us that are on the port staff now are very sensitive to, and we want to make sure that we are doing this right as we go forward. And if you can just go ahead and give us the next slide, Juanetta. Yeah, you can see all the way on the right-hand side the petroleum cement terminal and the related infrastructure that will be there when the 2021 season is finished. In the middle is the first terminal of the cargo dock replacement, and out there at the north end, that big area over there is a little bit of unconstruction that has to happen on a portion of what was the old port expansion project because of its instability. And in order to be able to safely continue to operate the old part of the port so that commerce can continue to come in here while we're constructing new, we have to make it a lot safer to dock the container ships when they come in, while there's a whole bunch of construction equipment where one of those, very close to where, one of those guys is going to be operating. You don't want to create a bathtub, if you will, that you have to shove 2 ships in around everything else that's going on. So we have to do a little bit of deconstruction and shave off some of that old stuff so that there's more maneuvering room for big vessels when they come into the dock. So that's why there's a lot of conversation that has to take place, you know, not only with the port users, but with the tugboat operators and the pilots to bring these ships in to make sure that we're doing this right. And at that point, I'll stop. And I'm happy to answer any questions that any of you might have.
Well, that's a phenomenal update. You know, when you started and you posed the question, if I'm going over information that's been gone over before, you know, one of the things that we find in this process is that we have people that come and go and have, you know, as time allows. And so it's always good to bring continuity into that discussion and really bring concepts and ideas forward. So you can, I don't think you can actually trud on and bring forward ideas that that aren't valuable to everybody. So we appreciate the depth and the insight that you've provided. You know, I guess one of the things that, just a little history of where we've been in the last year in the fits and starts of trying to get some momentum behind a physical document and bring it to a head. So we have about 2 to 3 months worth of meetings that we have scheduled so that we can start to get our draft and a physical white paper together. But in that process of what the work that we've already done, what we found is that that we have the pieces of infrastructure, but there's really no glue that's binding all of the strategy together that helps anybody really understand what they need to be doing locally, whether it's in Quethlook or Bethel or, you know, any of these outlying communities, Cantwell and Toke and so on, of what their local communities have to do to plug into disaster preparedness for food security. And so, you know, it's that lack of long-term strategy that what we found is it's really a matter of, there's not just one solution. It's a matter of a lot of these things have to be run in parallel. Some of these concepts of food security really require, you know, a 20, 30-year long investment strategy because we don't have the infrastructure even for sustainability into our agricultural industry in Alaska. You know, we've had, for those of us that have been around in Alaska for a long time, we know the fits and starts of, you know, dairy production out of Point Mac in that area, right? And the problems that even we've had in developing and maintaining a viable protein-based market using the meat market over there out of Palmer. And so really the question is we've got a lot of good ideas and some, you know, we've tested where theory and reality meet with respect to what can we do now versus what are some long-term strategies that we can put in place. But it's that policy, that public policy that brings it all together and demonstrates leadership, right? So that's kind of any general thoughts on your role there, because the reality is that on the short term, right, when we look at a major disaster that comes into Alaska, let's say that you know, we lose steamship capacity, and we've only got X amount of steamships that are available plying the Alaska trade that come into into the port. So you lose that capacity somehow, right? What next? You know, 2 weeks, a month, 6 months. So, you know, so any thoughts there?
Yeah, I can wax philosophical for a very long time because you touched on quite a few different points, Terry, and some of them have been, you know, vexing me for the longest time. So let me start talking, and then you tell me if I missed anything as we go along. I mean, as frustrated as you are it's the fact that there doesn't seem to be an advocate at the state level championing this issue. What's always been been vexing for me is that in a state that really is, for all intents and purposes, an island just like Hawaii, when you're looking at economics, why is there no one in state DOT keeping an eye on ports and harbors and looking at some kind of systemic approach of what is best for the state with respect to how to use and factor all of the port capability that we have into some kind of a plan for disaster response and discovery? We're just a bunch of fiefdoms, out for our own good. It's Game of Thrones. If you've got the legislators with the throw weight, you get all the attention, and it doesn't matter whether or not that's the best place to focus on a particular issue. I just cannot understand why, in a state that is so reliant on marine transportation, that there isn't anybody in state DOT that gives a damn about it. Now, don't want to blame them exclusively, because they are just following the behavior of their federal parents. Because in US DOT, ports nationwide suffer the same, redheaded stepchild syndrome. There isn't anybody at the federal level in DOT that is minding the store with respect to ports. Admittedly, there have been some cracks in that lately. The Port Infrastructure Development Program is a grant program that came out, last year for the first time, that we got a $20 million carve out from. Is the first time in my history that there was anybody in federal DOT that was taking an exclusive interest in infrastructure problems at ports. So I'm kind of hoping that that there's a shift coming, but I don't see it yet on the state level. So that's one issue. The other is, I think, as challenged as you are with figuring out a solution for food supplies, we're seeing the same thing manifest itself in the oil and gas market space, and also in the cement market space. What is interesting to me is within the state of Alaska, we have every single component required to make our own cement. We don't have a cement plant, and we don't have a cement plant because the cost of operating one, given what is the demand for cement volumes every year, is prohibitive. It's cheaper to bring it in from outside than it is to manufacture it here. And I think the oil refinery side of the equation has found the same phenomenon. We have watched since the Flint Hills refinery up in North Pole closed, we saw our tanker, refined petroleum tanker count go from what was 4 a year, because all of the refined petroleum was, or the vast majority of all the refined petroleum, which was mostly jet fuel, was being produced up in North Pole and came down by rail for distribution, and the port never saw much of that revenue at all. We saw the 4 tankers that came in every year to make up the delta between what North Pole could produce and what the demand was climb to almost 30, because now all that refined petroleum comes in from outside, because the refining capability of the state has dropped dramatically, and that's just in 10 or 11 years. So with this small market space here, it's very difficult to put a production capability in place that you can support with just the state consuming it, and that is always going to be a challenge here, as long as we like the fact that we share all this real estate with 750,000 people. So I think that creates a challenge for you guys as well. And I know when my wife and I go to farmers markets, and I look at what I got to pay for what is really really good, well-produced produce, it's way more than what I would pay if I walked into Cars or Fred Meyer's. So how do you strike that balance between what volume that's coming from somewhere else can provide value-wise with creating a sustainable, long-term capable infrastructure here in the state that you can support with revenue as opposed to subsidies in order to accomplish a mission. Man, it's really hard. Now, from the port's perspective, we know that we would like to think we add value to that which our users come here to do, or they would pack up and leave. But we are very sensitive to what it costs people to come here and use this port. And our goal is to make this place as low cost as it possibly can. I've listened for years, particularly when the state had money and everybody was competing with each other for capital money for all kinds of projects that when you sit back and look at them objectively were a lot of science projects that if you got 10, 15, 20 million from the state and you squandered it and failed, nobody cared. We're past that now. So you've got to be able to, go, if you get something, you got to be able to stand behind a product that you delivered from it. But back, back in the day, that kind of wastefulness was the way of the world. And then throw in the fact that we had some horsepower in Washington, and earmarks were the way to go. That you could extend that same, not having to pay attention to what you were doing with the money all the way to the federal level, money that you got from federal sources. So nowadays we have to be a little bit more sensitive to that. So we have to be very, very, very cost effective. When I've heard people make a case for money that they got because they were looking at, providing a service that would grow the economy, that would grow the industry up here, I just began to scratch my head. There's such a finite size to what it is we are. There hasn't been a initiative to increase any kind or provide any kind of manufacturing infrastructure here that would create a job market for people to come in from outside and grow the population, or would create a volume that needed a place to go to get it out of here. I mean, it's always been my experience that if a port is saying they're going to grow their business, the only way they're going to do is to steal it from somebody else, because there isn't, the pie is only so big up here in Alaska, and if you want a bigger piece, somebody's going to get a smaller piece. So that's that is the dynamic, I think, that we have to come to grips with the fact that it exists. And those are the dynamics and those are the variables that we have to deal with when we're trying to come up with solutions for things. It's hard. It's hard to find. It's not as, the market space is not as cut and dry as it is down in the lower 48.
No question.
My bad.
No. It's spot on. And what's really fun about it is that you brought two good examples of other industries, both the cement and the fuel, that struggle with the same supply demand characteristics. And so how do we get smarter about how we figure out these solutions? I just and I'm going to turn this over to the group to bring in their own Q&A, but one of the things that we did as a state, because we had to, right, in the oil industry, is we learned how to modularize everything, right? It's like everything was so expensive. What did we learn how to do on the North Slope? We learned how to compartmentalize things and to make it truckable modules so that we can manufacture it in an area that is a reasonable work environment. And then you take it to the North Slope and you plug it together and finish it up. But everything's pre-constructed before you get there. That's an Arctic, solution to how do we make it, something that fits into an economic model that makes sense, right? You just can't afford, to have 10 and 20% increases to cost all the time. It's not sustainable. How do you drive the cost down? And so, yeah, and that's really about what we have to do here as we learn from these institutional, I'm thinking institutional, the Alaskan memory, right? Those of us that have lived here in the last, through all the excess, right? When the state had no, there was no accountability because, hey, we've got a couple extra 500 million, we got $1 billion, and, we're throwing these numbers around. And finally, it's like, well, okay, there is a finite amount of resources. So when do we get smart? And so how do we do that? And how do we take those steps? So I'm going to, points are great. We're going to make sure we bring those forward because I want to talk to you about those offline and then and open it up to the team.
Yeah, Terry, we do have a question. Steve, is there a disaster preparedness alternate site if the Port of Alaska is disabled? Or, is there some sort of redistribution strategy if other ports maybe are disabled and freight might come into Anchorage as opposed to another port?
That's the $1 million question. And the answer I can give you is yes. But what has to be, what has to be considered is, the answer also is it depends. The port of Anchorage, now the Port of Alaska, became what it is in 1964 after the big earthquake, because the main port of entry for everything that was coming into the state in 1964, Seward, wasn't there anymore. It was Sealand that did most of the big that did damn near all of the big container ship deliveries into Seward, and then by road or rail, it came out of there, and it made its way to the rest of the state. Realize at the time the state population was as big as the population of Anchorage is now, but so the road system and the rail system and the assets that were available could support that on what was the Seward Highway, in 1964, and what was the rail system in 1964. The only port left standing after that earthquake in South Central was the little port of Anchorage, because it was only 3 years old. So the infrastructure was very new. And then we also found out as a consequence of that way up here at the top of Cook Inlet, we're tsunami proof. So everybody else who suffered, and I say everybody else, Whittier, Valdez, and Seward, where most of the commerce took place because geographically it's closer to the West Coast, all of that was devastated. So the question then becomes, if it happens again, where's plan B going to be? And the answer really is your guess is as good as mine. And I know that the State Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management has plans. I know that FEMA has plans for Alaska. I know that every one of the port users here has a disaster response and recovery plan if they have to go someplace else besides here. But all of those are predicated on the fact that there will be a someplace else to go that's more viable than where it is they're coming now. And depending upon what the disaster is, you just don't know where that's going to be. We don't have the luxury of being the West Coast, where if God forbid something happens in Seattle, you've got ports in Oregon, you've got ports in California that you can go to, and they're all connected by road and they're all connected by rail. So plan B is, there's going to be a little bit of interruption, but there's not going to be massive interruption before you get recovered. We don't have that luxury up here. We've got to have a certain amount of flexibility to be able to respond to a disaster with anything that floats that you could put stuff on. And in a lot of cases, we may see nothing but barges. And how many are there? Are there enough? Because most places you can get a barge into, and some places that depending on the type of barge you have, you don't even need a road to get into it to offload the darn thing. So, and I will tell you, I am certain that all of that's been talked about and all of that's been documented to some degree. I don't know the fine points and the details of it all. I know the state folks in FEMA, and even you throw the DOD in a little bit, have been wrestling with this for years. We don't have a lot of roads up here, and we only have one road that connects us down to the lower 48. And we, as I said, we are a marine environment, and even if you can, we have the big disaster in South Central, and Kodiak survives. Well, you can't drive here from there. So now what do you do? So there's a lot, there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of coordination that some kind of disaster response is going to have. But I guess I can be reassuring in that I can say that it's all been talked about. Sometimes the plan won't be perfect, but the planners all know each other, and we all stay in constant contact with each other. I don't lose sleep, but I also have a concern about, maybe it's not an Alaska problem. Maybe it's at the other end of the supply chain in Seattle and Tacoma. What if something happens down there that interrupts the flow that comes up here? What are those guys thinking about? Because they know that they have a big, they play a big role in the supply chain in Alaska. So, I have, since this whole pandemic thing has broken out, I've had, conversations every couple of weeks with John Wolf at the Northwest Seaport Alliance. And, he gives me the status of how things are going down there. We talk about what's going on up here. He is the landlord for Matson and Tote at the Tacoma end of this, and we're the landlords up here. So we have a vested interest in knowing what's going on in each other's wheelhouse, and that seems to be working well. And I sleep better knowing that I don't have to worry about the problems at the other end. And I think those kinds of communications are what's going to see us through anything in the long run.
Great, thank you. Steve, can you say a little bit about what the vulnerabilities are at the existing cargo terminals? What maybe does keep you up at night as far as the capacity of those two terminals and the vulnerabilities that they may have in the event of a disaster?
Sure, and this is also a story that hasn't changed in all the time I've been here. There's one thing that keeps me up at night, and that's the level of corrosion on the existing facility and the consequences of that should we have another significant earthquake. We were incredibly lucky in November 2018 that the damage was not greater than what it turned out to be. And the earthquake dynamics that you have to keep in mind are, there's magnitude, duration, depth, and distance. And 3 of those 4 were life enders. The only one that wasn't was duration. It was as frightening as it was, and as much of it as it felt like an eternity to those of us that were at work when it happened. It was 36 seconds. What happened in those 36 seconds? Had it been 36 more, could have been disastrous. There were enough indicators of what would be happening next had the duration been longer that we all sat here and said, all right, this is, we need to do what it is we can to prepare ourselves for the worst possible thing to happen. There was a crack that ran along the shoreline all the way from the north end of the port, way out where there isn't any, there isn't a whole lot of activity going on, all the way down past that cement dome to the south end of the port. That was within a few feet of the breakwater line. When you got out on the water side of that crack, whether you were down in the tide water, looking at at low tide, at what the bottom looked like, or you were out there walking on the fill area that was part of the old expansion project. When the geologists and the engineers came out to do an inspection on the place and looked, they found what's called sand boils, which is surface manifestations of liquefaction that was going on down below. And what that indicates to them is liquefaction was beginning to happen. And its duration that brings that to the point of where everything begins to let gravity take over and slide to the lowest point, because now it's behaving like water. Yeah, it's not behaving like dirt anymore. We were very close to that happening. So there were a lot of indications that we got lucky. We didn't find all the damage that we had under the dock right after the earthquake, because it was the fall. The ice was beginning to form on the piling, and the tides were not favorable enough to be able to really get under the dock and look at everything. But in the springtime, we found a significant amount of pile damage as a consequence of the earthquake that we have since repaired, at least begun the repairs on. The big ugly ones have all been fixed. The remainder we're playing catch up on, and we've added it to what is our normal annual maintenance program, where we go down and we put these sleeves on the worst corroded piles to be able to maintain the structural integrity of the dock, so that we can continue to support the operational loads that we need to stay open for business. But from a seismic perspective, they do absolutely nothing. In order to provide this place with the seismic resiliency that it's going to need to survive another 1964 type earthquake, or one similar to the one that happened in November 2018 of a longer duration, you've got to replace the docks. They're past the point of being reinforced or mended. They need to be replaced. And that new petroleum cement terminal is the first step in the dock replacement program, which is what this modernization program is all about. We've added thickness, strength to the piles that are going to be supporting that new dock. We've added an extra 4 feet to the height of the dock to take into consideration what could be sea level rise over the next 25, 30 years. So we will build all of that type of resiliency or design it all, I should say, into anything that we do going forward. That's really the solution. It's not, we can't fix the dock that we have and stay open for business at the same time because it's so disruptive, nor is it worth the effort, because the facility that we have now is over 50-something years old, and it's not even state of the industry. It hasn't been state of the industry since forever. And the users, when they compare what it is they have to use when they come here to what it is they get down in Seattle and even in Kodiak and Dutch Harbor, the quality of the infrastructure here is woefully lacking in comparison to all those other places. So getting up to state of the industry has to be part of the solution too. Otherwise you lose efficiency, and when you don't have efficiency, costs go up.
Yeah. I think we have time for one other question if anybody wants to open their mic and pose another question to Steve.
Yes, this is Bernie Smith. Steve.
Hi, Bernie. How are you?
When you had Tote and the other carrier make comments on the camera about, well, everybody was interested in toilet paper and everything, they basically said that everything is smooth, it's going like it's planned. Did it really go that way? Were there any delays at all of getting these container ships up here with the products that we need, or because of other supply problems they had down south?
Actually, it's exactly as they said it was.
Okay.
Within within the constraints that certain product lines were challenged. I mean, it wasn't like there was this warehouse full of toilet paper in Washington State, and we were not getting our fair share of it. If there was product to move to fulfill the what the shippers wanted, it came, and it came timely. There have been no delays in the deliveries into the Port of Tacoma for upload on the vessels. There were no longshore related delays that were keeping the ships from staying on the Sunday, Tuesday schedule that they've, that we're all used to seeing up here. So, quite honestly, the supply chain was operating as normal. Whether or not the quantities varied a little bit depended upon what was available to put into containers because of what production was delivering to the ports for packing. So we're all still challenged with that there are still holes on the store shelves, not because we have delays in delivery, but because production from the suppliers is not back to where it's meeting the demand and the demands that we're seeing, nor have the demands gotten back to normal yet along everything. There are still people that, if it's there, I'm going to get it. It may not be there the next time. And so it's going to be a while before we're all out of that mindset of you better buy it when you see it because it may not be there anymore. It's interesting. I was when I was on active duty with the Air Force and stationed overseas, that was exactly how you behaved when you went to the commissary and when you went to the exchange. If you saw it, you bought it because you just never knew when you were going to see it again, if ever. So I think people are sort of still there. It's getting better, but people are still there. On the upside, the supply chain is delivering everything that the shippers are asking for on schedule. It's just a matter of being able to get everything they're asking for.
Well, thank you, Steve. We're coming right up at 10 o'clock, and I just want to mention to everybody that's still online, we do have a session next week that is slated with several of the organizations and agencies involved in mass feeding programs in the event of a disaster. So we do have the Salvation Army, the American Red Cross, Beans Cafe, and we hope to have somebody from Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services join us as well, so we can continue this discussion about the food supply chain in the event of a disruptive event. So please plan on joining us next week at Thursday at 9 a.m. for that event as well. And I do want to just add an apology. Steve, I think there were some built-in transitions in your slide deck, and you weren't aware of it. Thank goodness. You just kept on rolling, so that was great. We did have a moment where I had to jump out of the slide deck and try and override some of those transitions. So my apologies to folks as we were maybe being a little bit distracting with the slide deck, but I'll double check that next time so we don't have it. And with that, let me just turn it back to Terry for any final words.
Well, first, Juanita, thank you for hosting and getting this all together. It's a new technology for us all, and we all learn together, so thank you. And Steve, thank you for your thoughts and your ideas, and we appreciate your engagement and really welcome you to the study group, and we'd love to have you or staff members participate because we need that nuance and those questions from your perspective as we learn together. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next week.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Steve.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Hey, and you got the dress code correct.